Hey everybody, I'm Nick Layton.
And I'm Leah Bottima.
And we're the hosts of Were You Raised by Wolves?
Each week we try to make the world a kinder, nicer place.
Well, that's the idea, at least.
I mean, we try.
Have you ever wondered what to do if you're ghosted?
Or what to do when a friend asks you to borrow money?
Or the proper way to eat Cheetos?
You know, the big questions.
So please find Were You Raised by Wolves wherever you listen.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. It's our 15th year. I'm Jimmy Carboni, and I'm the host. We're here in Roberta's Pizza Studio in the backyard. We got some great guests, and I'm really excited to be here. I will say this, 15 years of Heritage Radio Network is really important. Check us out and support us at heritageradionetwork.org/donate. So we got a special guest here this is a cider show from the early days of Cider Week in New York at my old pub, Jimmy's Number 43. I got to meet some of the fine cider makers of the East Coast. So one of our guests is here. She wrote a great book.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I'm delighted to be here. There's so much history in this room. I mean, think of all the great leaders in the beverage world who've marched through here and have had a chance to sit down and talk with you and eat Roberta's pizza. And today we're going to talk about the book that I published last fall with the University of North Carolina Press, Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, The Surprising Story of Apples in the South.
By Diane Flynt.
Yes.
So Diane, when I first met you, it was a special time in cider, and I think in the East Coast. First Cider Week was just getting organized, and some of I call them fine cider makers, you and Steve Wood and others were in New York City. Now, let's start at that time, because I know you went through a lot to get there, apples, and a lot of discoveries that are in your book, Wild, Tamed, Lost, and Revived. But let's talk about that time. I remember seeing you, we talked about things like fine cider, but and how did you come up with that style of cider? Because a lot of our listeners don't quite know what happened even back then in 2011, 2012.
Well, even then we were all pioneers, even people like Steve Wood and Eleanor Leger and Autumn Stoschek. We were all plowing new ground because the only cider that had been in the market for so long was a more commercial cider. And all of that group, all the people I just mentioned, as well as me, we were wanting to grow cider apples that were either intended for cider or were dessert fruit that also made good cider. And we wanted to turn that into a beverage that reflected the place where that fruit was grown, a specific place. And Foggy Ridge Cider, the cidery I founded back in 1997, was the first cidery south of Massachusetts. And Jimmy, when I opened our tasting room in the early 2000s, Virginia has an active wine industry, and people would walk in the door and say, "What grapes is this made from?" So we were all pioneers, and certainly I was in the South. People don't associate apples with the South and don't even associate cider with the South. But in fact, the first orchards in America planted by colonizers were planted in Jamestown, Virginia, not Massachusetts. And some of the most prolific cider makers and drinkers were Southerners.
It's quite interesting. And I'm really thrilled that you wrote the book and I got to read it. I think it's going to teach a lot of us things. You've won some awards. Kitchen Arts and Letters has you featured.
Yes, we were. I'm honored to be among the nominees for the first Knock Waxman Kitchen Arts and Letters Literary Prize. There's some great books on that list, and I'm happy to be one of them.
That's great. I'm just really thrilled that you're here. And, Wild, Tamed, Lost, and Revived is a great book, and I've got it in my hands, and she signed it for me. So way back in the old days, yeah. In the book, I learned that your dad was interested in different types of food and authenticity when you were growing up.
Well, he was an engineer, but he was a farm boy. My grandparents were farmers. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how close to the land that we're so far from where our food is produced today. Many people are. And Southerners noticed the world around them, and the South was a fertile region for apple growing. When apples arrived on the East Coast in the South, perhaps with the Spanish and Portuguese in Florida, perhaps down the spine of the Appalachians from the seeds that came very early in the 1500s to Maine, another great apple region. As soon as those seeds landed in the South, seedling apples sprung up everywhere. It's a very fertile territory. And Southerners noticed those apples. And I'm talking about indigenous Southerners, Black Southerners, enslaved Southerners, as well as the colonizers who moved to Southern states. They noticed the world around them and saw that wild fruit and chose it. They put their desire on it because, of course, your listeners probably know about apple sex. And they probably know that each apple seed is the combination of the DNA of two parents, and therefore each seed is a brand new tree.
Since you said that, Diane, it was on my note for every page of my notes. Ask Diane about apple sex and hybrid vigor.
Hybrid vigor, yes.
This is a fun show.
Yeah, I know. We talk about sex very early on. So seedling trees are all they're seed-grown trees, and so they're unique genetically, just like the biological offspring of two human parents. So the South was like a giant experiment station for apple varieties, and Southerners began noticing the fruit and choosing it and putting names on it, and that's the tamed in my title. They began taming that fruit by grafting it. And humans have known how to graft for 2,000 years. It's not hard. And that happened, very early on because many of the English apple varieties that came to Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina just did not flourish well in those climates. But Southern apples grew from Mississippi, Louisiana, Mobile, Alabama exported an apple to northern states for almost 100 years. The most important Southern nurseries in the 19th century were outside Augusta, Georgia, and Columbia, South Carolina. I think we put Southern apples in a ghetto of the Mountain South, but in fact, Tidewater, Virginia, after the Civil War, exported early season apples to Boston, to your hometown. So and to me, that, Jimmy, that's the reason I wrote this book. This book is not about apples. It's about the people and the places and the culture behind that fruit. Because every apple that holds a name, and there are almost 2,000 apple varieties that either originated in the South or were very widely grown there, every one of those was chosen by a person. And so it carries a history and it carries an imprint. And to me, that's what's fascinating about this world of agriculture. And going back to my dad, he was a noticer. He was just like those early Southerners who saw that apple that ripened in June. And they said, gosh, I'm dying for fruit. There's no other fruit here in June, so I'm going to graft that tree. And I'm going to name it the Jimmy Carbone apple.
No one's done that yet, but it's okay.
There's still time.
Well, when you wrote the book, was all this information available? How did you research it?
That's a great question. When I started this book, I'd been growing apples for, 20-something years. I've been making cider commercially. We now sell our apples to other cider makers. I'm still very involved in the industry. And, I thought very close friends with Lee Calhoun, the author of Old Southern Apples, the classic encyclopedia of Southern apples. And I knew his collection well. He collected over 450 Southern varieties, many grown by indigenous groups in the South, many what we call Cherokee apples. I thought I knew something about Southern apples, but I didn't. I associated apples and the South as the Mountain South, because that's where we see most apples today. But there's such a rich history. The South had more family apples than other regions of the country. And these are apples that were grown by a single family. The Flynt family might have had a family apple. And when a son or daughter got married and moved away, they would pull up a root sucker or graft a tree and say, take this with you to your new home. There are apples like Aunt Sally. Apple is only grown in Chatham County, North Carolina. It didn't appear in nursery catalogs. It was confined to an area. And what that says to me is that fruit held significance. It was a cultural marker. It was a symbol. So that was the fascinating part of my research. And fortunately, we have lots of resources. I visited in person over 30 university archives, many, many more digital archives. I did a lot of the research during COVID. I think the archivists are fabulous people, among my favorite people in the world. And I think they had, they weren't having in-person visits. So I got a lot of digital material from libraries. And then the National Agricultural Library is something that all of your listeners can access online. And there's fascinating information, as well as the beautiful botanical illustrations. I used many of them in my book that were created when the Department of Agriculture was formed and the Division of Pomology was formed in the 1880s. And there are thousands of beautiful drawings of American fruits, nuts, and berries.
It is amazing the connection of agriculture and what's in your glass and what's on your plate. About wild apples, I've heard some people say, well, why do we graft at all? Why don't we just go in the woods and enjoy the wild apples? That's a broad statement, but you must have thought about that.
We have a few wild apples on our farm. Our farm is at 250 acres in the southern Appalachians, the Blue Ridge Mountains, at the corner of Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. We're at 3,000 feet elevation, so our climate is very similar to New York and the Hudson River Valley, and lots of seedling trees around. And many of them are biennial, so they only bear every other year. Most of the ones on our farm are quite bitter, quite tannic. They're not edible. I think they have potential for cider making, perhaps as a tannin addition. But I think Southerners and others chose apples for many uses that wild apples can't fulfill. There's an apple called the horse apple. It's a southern apple. It's a big green apple. I grow it. It's very densely fleshed, very, very tart, very dry. And it was grown as a drying apple. And in fact, Lee Calhoun used to say that you rarely saw the horse apple in a nursery catalog in the South because everybody already had a horse apple in their backyard.
I saw that in your book. There was a picture of some people drying apples on the roofs.
Yes, and on metal sheets. Those are from Kentucky and from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. So people wanted fruit all year. And in the South, you can have fresh apples even before refrigeration from June, Carolina Red June, all the way to Winter John and Albemarle Pippin and Wine Sap that you harvest in late October that then keep in a root cellar or even piled under straw in the middle of a field will keep until May. So prior to refrigeration, and wild apples don't give you that. There's a romance to foraging now, and I totally encourage that and am fascinated by it and forage for morels and ramps and chanterelles on our farm. But choosing fruit that originally was wild and replicating it, it's choosing a use. It's choosing an apple that's especially good for cider, like Albemarle Pippin, or is just really, really sweet and tasty and bears annually like Grimes Golden or, last all winter like, Arkansas Black. Those are all uses that tied apples to people and that you can't get from that wild apple growing down by the spring house on our farm.
Diane, what started this bug with you? Were you making cider first? Were you growing apples first? Did you have a farm?
I was a banker in my early life, and often writers will say till I saw the light and returned to my farming roots. I actually enjoyed my corporate career and gained a lot of skills that I put to work in the cider business and apple business. But I think what I wrote in my book about my father's deep ties to the natural world and riding around with him on country roads in Georgia and having him swerve over to the side of the road and dig up a plant or gather seed. Or I was always just very connected to the natural world. And that is there's a landscape design term called line of desire. And you can see that illustrated on any public park or college campus. It's the shortest distance between 2 points, which is often not the sidewalk. And
follow the well-trod path.
Exactly. And I think anyone who's a deep thinker about life, and I think that's almost everybody really, has desires that pull them, has something that's constantly nagging at you. And I think it's important for us as humans to ask ourselves repeatedly, throughout our lives, what is pulling at me? What is pulling me? And that is that line of desire. And, I published this book at age 70. And that line of desire is connected to 2 things for me. One is riding around with my dad in that dusty station wagon, connected to the natural world, noticing everything, noticing trees, noticing seeds that are ripening, noticing, plants that you want to dig up or graft. And the other is, for me, it's the smell of linseed oil, because that was what coated the floors of the Hawks Children's Library in my hometown of West Point, Georgia. And it was a little 1-room children's library. And I sat on that hardwood floor and I read every book in that library, probably twice. And that deep intellectual curiosity, that desire not only to experience the natural world, but to know things, to discover things in writing. Today, when I smell linseed oil, I'm taken back immediately to the Hawks Children's Library. That's my line of desire. That's what led me to seek a career, a second career, third career, in connection to the natural world, growing apples. And that was stimulating and a journey, an exploration, which is making cider. And I'm thrilled today to be able to sell my apples to cider makers who continue that exploration. And I know you've interviewed many young cider makers and experienced cider makers who are trying all different kinds of things. And I applaud that. The people I sell my apples to don't make cider like I made cider, but all the better for it. They're finding their own line of desire.
Oh, that's great. That's a great intro. And your friend walked in from Virginia. Kerrie, how are you?
I'm good.
You traveled up here with her. Do you have any questions for her for the book? Or I know you read the book.
Yes, no.
Wild, Tame, Lost.
I have my own autographed copy. Thank you very much. And but every time I am with Diane, I'm astounded. I watch her and listen to her and her, as she said, her great curiosity. It's not just, if you're ever with Diane, it's not just with apples. It's with everything. It's with how was this pavement made and when was it and who designed it and the library, all the things. And I don't have that kind of brain. And so, I mean, I know your story. I've picked a couple of apples with you, luckily. And
This lady can actually work. She is very strong. A lot of people say they're going to pick apples and they go home by 10 o'clock.
no, I will pick apples all day long.
Well, wait, so tell us, what was your apple picking day like? What time did you start? What are a couple of things? What do you actually do when you pick apples?
Well, you have to shake the trees. You go in first. You find the apples, like on the ground that aren't eaten or whatever. You find the good apples. You have to get those. You have to shake the trees. You have to get the apples out of the trees. Then you have to get the apples they're everywhere. And there's like, no, you can't have that apple, but you can have that apple. And I'm looking at like, I don't know if I see the difference in an apple.
It's a full body workout.
It's a full body workout. And then at the end of the day, you get fed this divine, incredible meal that they've not only prepared, but actually grown on their farm.
This is really an ad to get people to come help us
Oh my
harvest
God,
apples
it's really,
this fall.
no. It's just, I like an apple. I'm going to tell you, I like an apple, but I would have never had any desire to love an apple if it wasn't for Diane's curiosity, her passion, her energy behind the stories, the life behind it. It's like, who knew that one apple could have so much history behind it? And
So tell me a story that you've told her, because we're going to go somewhere with this.
Gosh. Well,
tell me about, you were grafting. I was like, what's up with this tree?
that's a great story. Yeah. So when I began selling apples rather than making cider from them, I needed to make my orchard a little more, I need to focus on fruit that other people would want. And I had grown apple varieties that were uncommon in the late 90s when I planted them, but now a lot of people grow Harrison and a lot of people grow Albemarle Pippin. So I did something with the help of an excellent nurseryman, Raul Godinez, outside of Waynesboro, Virginia, Countryside Nurseries, Raul and Mary Godinez. We top worked a big chunk of one of my orchards. And top working is an ancient art. You cut off, you have roots. In my case, they were 20-something-year-old apple trees, so the roots were 20-something years old. And you cut the trunk off. We leave a nurse limb below that cut, and then you graft onto that stump and onto the limbs, and you graft the new variety. So you have your 20-year-old roots, you have your original variety, and then you have your new variety on top. And what Kerrie saw a couple of years after those little tiny grafts, this diameter of a pencil, as they grow up, you braid them, twist them and tie them in a certain way, and they begin to fuse. And so what looks like this giant upside down braided pigtail becomes an entirely new tree on top of the old one. And, some people push over trees and replant. I wanted to keep my original spacing. Also, I'm 70 years old and I had 25-year-old roots. I thought I might as well use them and get fruit quickly. And that's been a real success. And I'm so glad you raised this, Kerrie, because the first variety I top worked was the Redfield apple. And I did that in honor of Terry Maloney, the founder of West County Cider.
Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts, and his son Field and his wife are still running that wonderful cidery, West County Cider. And they still make a beautiful cider, I believe, made with the Redfield apples. And I actually got my grafting wood from Field.
That's pretty great. There's so many questions that I'm going to keep asking myself. Now, making cider. Everybody wants to make cider. The sadness, but also the beauty of why I love the hard cider world is that there's a lot of new people that are willing to try it, and a lot of them don't. They realize after a while that it's a hobby for them more than a business. But first out making cider. What are your pointers? And what's the learning curve? That must be part of making the cider.
Right. It's like so many things. It's easy to do, but hard to do well. And it's something you can study and should study. You certainly need to know something about chemistry. You need to know fermentation science. You need to read and understand the way things interact, so that you know where you're headed with flavor. But after that, you need to do it. You need to experiment, and every year will be different. There is something called terroir, and harvest, vintage differences. So, the fruit, my Hughes crab this year will be very different than my Hughes, not very different, but they'll be different than the Hughes crab we grow last year because the climate will be different. We'll certainly have a lot more because we've had a very favorable spring, and last year was not so hot. So it's gaining the knowledge and digging in and not being afraid to tackle subjects that might be intimidating, but then it's also doing it and then evaluating it. And I found it so helpful to work with my colleagues in the wine industry. As I said, I was the only cider maker south of Massachusetts. I didn't have many local colleagues. So I think anyone who understands fermentation science, especially winemakers, because you're fermenting a fruit juice, but also I think brewers as well, have educated palates and can help new cider makers figure out where they're going wrong and also how to pursue what they want.
I was going to ask you if you got knowledge from your Virginia winemaker friends, and you answered that question before I asked.
Definitely. And I'm give a plug for the Virginia wine industry. Virginia makes excellent wine. There are some varietals that do especially well in our climate, and it's a very, Bordeaux style wines, not the heavy, high sugar wines that you often see in the hotter climates of California. Very elegant wines.
It's quite interesting, and we're going to have a lot more to talk about. We're going to take a short break on Beer Sessions Radio. Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. We're back with the second half of the show. We're with Diane Flynt, cider person from Virginia, author of Wild, Tamed, Lost, and Revived. And, I knew you back in 2011, 2012. Like everything, craft beer, cider, there's so many new players, new growers, new makers. I want to make sure that people know about you, as well as the others like Steve Wood and, the Maloney's at West County. How do you see the new cider scene? What's your role in it? I know that you're still growing apples. So tell us about the connections you have. The real question is, why did you stop making cider too?
Well, one reason was I wanted to write this book. I wanted a different intellectual challenge. And I'm really a creator, Jimmy. I'm not a maintainer. And Foggy Ridge had become a real business. We began by distributing our cider in Virginia and North Carolina. And by 2019, we were in 25 states. And I spent a lot of my time, on the phone and on my laptop running the business. And that was not why I created that business. But I still wanted to have a connection to the cider world, and the idea of selling our fruit to other cider makers, I think was a good transition. It freed up time for me to create something else. In this case, 2.5 years of research and writing to create this book. But it's also given me connection with other cider makers, much younger than I am, who are doing different things. And I love seeing what they do with our fruit.
That's great. Thank you. When I think about that, you're making me think about other, I'll call you legends, like you, and I know Steve Wood at Farm Hill. He's got a lot of apples. He's been selling not only grafts and fruit and juice to other people. Do you guys talk about that vision of how you guys do you feel like you paved the way for a lot of the heirloom apples, and what kind of mentoring role will you guys play? Because especially if you're not able to make cider anymore.
Well, that's an interesting question. That takes me back to some of my first conversations with Steve. He's such a dear friend, and I've always admired him. He's been a great supporter of me and of the industry.
Steve Wood
at Farnham Hill, and also Eleanor Leger at Eden, and Autumn Stoschek at Eve's Cider outside of Ithaca. And those three, I think, have been the people I've talked with mostly about, to the greatest extent, about cider. But I remember calling Steve in the mid-'90s. I was planning my orchard, and I was trying to figure out which trees I wanted to grow. And I said, Steve, I know what trees you're growing. What should I grow? And he said, I'm not going to tell you that. And I was very kind of huffy. I was like, well, he's not going to help me. He's not helping me. But then I quickly realized that, what grows in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and what performs well for him, and what makes the style of cider Steve was aiming to make, which was different than what we were aiming to make, isn't the same for Virginia. So while I give a lot of advice and point new growers and new cider makers in directions and try to be a mentor to as many people as possible, people also have to figure out what works in their space. And it's not just what will grow and what will produce apples, but what will give the flavor that will take that cider maker where they want to go. What style do they want to make? I wanted to make a very elegant wine-style cider. I write in the book that I wanted to make a cider that tasted like peach skins smell. And it was those delicate flavors that I was really aiming for. And I do appreciate a robust cider, a big, bittersweet flavor. To me, that's a delicious cider. But that wasn't the cider I was aiming for. And I think each cider maker has to figure out what their flavor vision is. I do have a little piece from my book that you and I talked about my potentially reading, and it has to do with being a beginner. So would you want me to read that?
I'd love to have you read it. Thank you.
So I picked this out because I know we've got a lot of drinkers out there listening to this. What do you think?
I think you're onto something.
I think I'm onto something. And maybe even some cider makers and home brewers who've experienced this. But this speaks to that line of desire that I'll talk about. So this is the night before our first commercial cider pressing at Foggy Ridge Cider in Douglasburg, Virginia. This would have been in the early 2000s. One September night, just before our first pressing, I drove up to our house to grab sandwiches to fuel our last hour of work. From our steep driveway, I could see the long, low cider house tucked below Tony Goad's cow pasture, lights blazing and the tractor idling by the loading dock. A tiny crescent moon rose in the deep purple sky above the orchard. Steam poured off the crush pad from the pressure washer and billowed in white clouds off the tail of my little building. I got out of the truck and stood under the stars, feeling as if I was at the top of a swing. That moment when you rise to the top of the arc and you are just for a second breathless. My cider house looked like a ship on a green sea, powered by steam-colored rolling waves. Despite all the paradoxes that had plagued me in this urgent moment, I felt at peace. Work was both numbingly difficult and full of joy. I was inexperienced and I was insightful. I was afraid and I was courageous. I was ready to sail my little ship.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So my book covers the people and the places and the events behind the journey of apples in the South from the 1500s to the 21st century. And at the start of each chapter is a piece like this, a short couple of pages on my own journey from conceiving of Foggy Ridge cider, making really crappy cider, in my basement, figuring out what I was doing.
So you
planting
did
trees.
make crappy cider.
I did make
basement.
crappy cider. It was inspired me though. Planting trees, those early days, and then really building a business. And then figuring out that my line of desire had shifted and I needed to re-anchor that back in the natural world and in creation, an intellectual discovery and creating, not maintaining. So this book is, I've already said it's not about apples, it's about people, but it's also about me. You'll learn a lot about me by reading this book.
No, I love it. What I've read so far, and I'm gonna. It's one of those books I'm keeping with me, and I always read a little bit of it.
Yeah, you can dip into it at any point.
Yeah, no, it's really great. Kerrie, we're going to talk more. I have more questions for you, but I know you had another question for her before. You were talking about picking apples with her.
Well,
I like the work talk. I like to hear about what people actually do.
Well, this is actually okay. This is a little different, but so. As you're talking about the apples and the cider and the different ciders and the new ciders, and then you were talking about sort of like grapes and wine, it brought me to, is there going to be, or is there now a sommelier for a great cider? Because, if you think about the great regions of France, you think about Bordeaux or Burgundy or Champagne or, and the sommeliers that learn about those grapes that grow in those regions. And you spoke to, the grapes that grow for me, as opposed to the grapes that grow in Ithaca, it's obviously very different. Mm-hmm. So maybe your next journey, are you to become a sommelier or?
Well, they're actually, Jimmy, I think you should talk about this because you know many of the palmiers.
Is that, I was wondering, what is the name of it?
Yeah, the Cider Association has some great programs, and you should check them out. Look at Pick Cider on Instagram. I don't know the exact specifics. I know that it's out there. Palmier. There's the courses. Certified Cider Professional is a great way to get started. So you're seeing the cider industry grow up in ways that it hasn't yet, and I know you can trace it back to Diane and Steve Wood and some others and the Maloney's who were first growing heritage apples and then making ciders, and then maybe even in 2000 there was new energy and entrepreneurship about ciders. And now the last 5 years there's a new generation of makers, of people who want to learn how to make it, people who are planting, buying a farm and planting 300 to 600 trees at a time because they're so passionate. And also the Cider Association. I know that the recent CiderCon for the first time they brought in a wide range of media, including beer writers and beverage writers. And Michelle of the American Cider Association has been doing a great job.
I'm so glad you mentioned Michelle McGrath. I really wanted to give a shout out for her. She's the executive director of the American Cider Association, has been such a leader in the industry. She's been awarded for that, and it's many awards, and she deserves every one of them. And she was a real leader in creating the certified palmier. There's a series of certifications and training that can educate everyone from serving staff to buyers and distributors. And I see a lot of distributors educating themselves more deeply about cider. When I first started distributing Foggy Ridge cider, we were the first cider on many distributors' lists. Some would have a Normandy cider, but none had a domestic cider. And I spent a lot of time talking to sales reps about what cider is and tasting them through. And I always tasted them on ciders, not just mine, but some of the best ciders in the country, many from the Northeast.
12, 13 years ago, I would open for non-cider drinkers in my restaurant, either a bottle of Farnham Hill cider or Eve's cider or Foggy Ridge when we had it. And it turned them on pretty fast. And I think the biggest change, you're seeing it whether there's palmiers or there's dedicated press about cider. Also that you go into a typical bar restaurant and now they're probably going to have at least one cider selection. It's a generational change. And I'm seeing people of a certain age, say under 40 or 50, there's a small niche of people that are dedicated cider drinkers. And they may not be cider geeks, but they like the category. And I think that what the work that's been done in the last 20 years, it's just paying off, but also this generation that has had 20 years of this industry going on, for them now it's not so hard. It's not only that they're interested in it, it's not so hard to find a good cider, or at least a cider.
My two oldest, just so you know, Selena and Zane, are huge cider drinkers.
Excellent.
I know.
Nice. And they're in their 20s, right? Yeah. So the other side of the growth in cider, and from the consumer standpoint, is the growth in orchards. And it's just wonderful to see people plant lots of trees. And I like to see cider makers plant trees. But I especially like to see commercial orchardists plant trees, because commercial orchardists really know how to grow trees. And sometimes when you're trying to make cider and grow trees, one or the other suffers a little bit. But to see commercial orchards put in big blocks of apples devoted to the cider industry is really exciting. And the last part of my book, called Revived, is about the 21st century. It's about 21st century Southern orchards and how all the different models for how Southerners are figuring out how to keep apples in the ground. And cider is one of those. I'm thinking of a couple, one Virginia orchardist and one in North Georgia, that have just done a great job of taking a piece of their business and focusing on cider. It's not the dominant part, but it's a profitable part for them, and it's brought them new audiences.
Well, things have really changed in the last 30 years. I know in old time, again, it seems like in a lot of agriculture, there's those multi-generational families that may have been in apples. And I know a guy, I don't want to say his name, whose family had some big apple farms in Vermont in the 20th century. And he grew up doing that. And to go off on his own, he was hired by someone, I think it was in Georgia, to plant Granny Smith apples. And apparently that was how he cut his teeth, and it never quite worked out. And he ended up coming back to upstate New York and having a typical apple farm where they do make some ciders, but it's like a pick your own. Does that resonate with you, that some entrepreneur said, hey, I'm going to bring down a New England apple grower and we're going to grow Granny Smith in Georgia? Does that sound crazy now?
It does sound very crazy, because there are like 2,000 apples varieties that grow really well in the South, and that's not one of them. Yeah.
But that's I'm only saying that as the learning curve of an industry.
Right. Well, there's so
obviously
much
back
more.
then there was someone that was an entrepreneur with money who wanted to plant a big farm, and he only wanted to plant Granny Smith.
Well, Thomas Jefferson said when he was an old man, he said, I'm an old man but a young gardener, because he understood that it takes many lifetimes to learn what you need to know about plants. I think if I had another couple rounds of 70 years, I would probably maybe figure out how to grow great cider apples.
Yeah, so back to your generation, you and let's say Steve Wood, because we know the next generation's running West County, fields there and taking that over. But for Steve and for you, you've got, these great trees. You're the most distinctive apple growing collection in your states. What are the next plans? Is someone going to take over your farm one day?
We shouldn't be. And I do not think mine is the most distinctive in the South. There are wonderful apple collections. I write about some preservation orchards. Lee Calhoun's collection of, almost 400 apple varieties. He gave that to the state of North Carolina. And the state maintains the Southern heirloom apple orchard at Horn Creek Farm in Pinnacle, North Carolina, outside of Winston-Salem. And you can, consumers can go there and see the trees and taste apples in the fall. And they also graft those apples and sell apple trees twice a year. So I think, the best thing, I think, you keep talking about us old timers. I think we still have a lot left in us, Jimmy. We still have a lot more to create. I still have career number 4 to engineer. But I think the best thing we can do is encourage and share wisdom and mentor and not hold on to things. Be professionally generous and and hopefully inspire many more orchards and cider makers out there.
Yeah, and I've seen Steve Wood take that role in New England, where there's a lot of younger cider makers, and a lot of people have gone to him for grafts and also for apples, so they can, before they have their own apples, they're getting some from Steve as well as some juice. And he's modest about it, but I feel like he supplies a lot of people with, especially when they're starting out.
Absolutely.
Well, hey, this has been great. I got this wonderful book in front of me. Wild, Tame, Lost, and Revived. Thanks for putting up with me, because I'm kind of stuttering over my words because I'm in awe of my friend Diane Flynt, who I haven't seen in years. And I'll still say Foggy Ridge was always. It was might have been CiderCon. It was something else in the last year. And there was a photo of a bottle share. Oh, and someone had a bottle of Foggy Ridge.
Oh, an antique bottle.
So if they had that up, how old was that bottle?
Gosh. Well, their last production year was 2018. So, yeah, it's been around. It's time to drink that sucker.
Oh, yeah. Ciders are meant to drink. And shout out to some other friends, Paige Fiore from Boutique Wine and Spirits, probably the finest liquor store in New York State that's selling over 100 different regional indie ciders.
Kudos
she was going to come.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, she wasn't able to, but she's got a special Orchard Hill Bone Dry cider on draft right now. And our other friend at Cider Bro, Lou Amaro, he had a couple Aaron Burr ciders in the fridge, and he wasn't able to leave work. So it worked out great, and your friend Kerrie came. So Kerrie, you guys, let's go around the room, say your names, and we'll close it out.
Kerrie Orrell Ellison.
Diane Flynt from Foggy Ridge Cider.
And where are you from, Kerrie?
Greensboro, North Carolina.
All right, and I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host on Beer Sessions Radio. Big thanks to our engineer, Armin Spengen. Thanks, Armin, for all you do. And this show will be up probably in May sometime of 2024. So thanks so much again. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you, guys. Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.
Hey, it's Francis Lamb, host of The Splendid Table. Every week on our show, we talk about food and cooking and the meanings of food and cooking. We talk with the most interesting people in food about their techniques, their culture, and everything in between. Whether it's about how fried chicken took over the world or how Instagram changes the way people are actually eating. It's a food show where everyone is welcome. Come join us. You can listen to The Splendid Table wherever you get your podcasts.